Hi, everyone. Allison Zmuda, and I am thrilled to continue my conversation with Starr Sackstein. Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
And Starr has written a fabulous second edition of Hacking Assessment, which will be out August 2nd. So when this interview is up, I am sure it will be hot off the presses. So definitely we'll make a link down below so that you can go right to the Amazon bookstore and purchase your copy. Starr, thank you again for joining me and continuing our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having the conversation. It's important.
Well, it's so exciting because as we continue to have this kind of dynamic interaction, the what you just started to describe at the end of the second segment really dovetails beautifully with the third idea around how are we continuing to um, see students through an assets or strengths based lens, but also how can we actually continue to cultivate a level of um, protocol and routine around two significant and incredibly important areas, especially if you're going to be engaging in this feedback loop process. So I want to talk first about reflection, second about self-evaluation, and then the ideas of how they are feeding and interacting with one another. So let's first talk about the power of reflection.
Yeah. So personally, for me, I did national board certification a bunch of years ago. And I think when I was doing that process, I was struck by how powerful it was to really consider my practice in a way I had not considered it before. And I'm a pretty reflective person naturally. I'm always looking to do better, find the things that, like, whether it was in sport when I was younger, as an athlete, or even as a writer, I'm probably my biggest critic in terms of expectations and how I communicate with people. But national board certification, if you haven't done it as a teacher and you've been teaching for a while and you're looking for that thing that's going to make you better if you're not getting the feedback you need, I highly recommend it. It's an extremely reflective process where you're forced to watch video of yourself doing certain things and really reflecting on what you see. And aside from being mortified from time to time about what I saw on that video and watching myself do it, it was just so powerful. And I think from that experience is basically how I started shifting into that practice in my classroom, that and teacher clarity issues. So, like, for example, once I thought I created this amazing project, and we have these great ideas, and maybe the idea itself was great, but the execution was not so great. And I got the work back from my students, and I got about 20 different varieties of what I thought I was going to get back. And I guess on some level, as a teacher, you could blame kids that the reason it came in wrong was because they didn't follow directions. But I take a different route and say, well, obviously, if that many kids had that many variations, it's clearly a teacher clarity issue and not a student clarity issue. Obviously, they could have come to me for help and got clarity, but I should have been clearer in my directions. So I started correcting that two ways. First, I did start doing the projects before I gave them to kids so that I could kind of figure out if I was actually as clear as I thought I was. And then the second part of that was to start adding into the reflections I was asking them to do a paragraph at the very beginning where they explained to me what it is they thought they had to do. And really, what that did for me is it gave me a lens through which to assess their learning that directly aligned with what they were trying to achieve instead of what I wanted them to achieve based on what I put into that assignment. And it became a much truer form of assessment because now I'm not using this rubric that was meant for something over here, especially if the kid didn't approach the assignment that way. And it had this more authentic feel to it. Plus, it forced students to really think about their process. What do I need to do to be successful in this work? What are the steps I took to get there?
Right.
And as I started bringing the language of the standards and competencies into the learning as well, giving them that academic vocabulary, the expectation became you speak to me about your performance on those particular skills and be able to indicate inside of your reflection the spaces you think you handled or didn't handle those particular skills well. And by reading those reflections before I assessed them, I knew what their goals were. I knew how to differentiate the feedback I was giving them. So it became a time saving element, believe it or not, because now the feedback they were getting was really specifically aligned to the work that they were doing. And it gave me an in for differentiating in a way that I couldn't do whole class with instruction, which I think always works when you can personalize it in that way.
So let's now move into the space of self-evaluation. What's
Sure.
the meaningful um, differences between reflection and self-evaluation, and then
Sure.
how do they interact with one another?
Absolutely. So for me, reflection is really thinking about the metacognitive process of learning. So it's this is what I did and how I did it and why I did it. And if I had the opportunity to do it differently next time, these are the things I might tweak because this is what I learned from doing it the wrong way. So there's this like iterative back and forth with reflection where you're looking at your body of work and thinking about how successful you were at it. And of course, the big piece here too for teachers is the more involved you have with student involvement with students for co-construction of success criteria before you start, the better aligned that's going to be for the evaluative piece. They need to know their targets before they start working. So popping a rubric out there right when it's time to assess
Right.
is not the best way to get the most out of them. It's almost like asking someone to show up at your house before maps and navigation systems were available and you just gave them an address and said,
Good
see
luck.
ya. Yeah. Versus that step-by-step way of getting there and maybe adding landmarks to make it more, readily available for them to see their way successfully there on the first try.
Yeah.
And with self evaluation, there are some agreed upon success values that they're also taking into account. And if a grade or a mastery level is required, now you have those levels clearly spelled out, whether it's on a progression or a rubric. I counsel people away from a 4 point rubric because I don't see a point in telling kids what subpar work looks like. Levels 1 and 2 do not need to be described in detail about how you achieve under proficiency, which is why, like, the single point rubric to me is probably the best, simplest way of doing it, where you have the criteria they need to meet right in front of them, which is grade level proficient. Maybe you give them examples of what that looks like, and we tease out what success looks like from those examples and how they align to the particular criteria you're working on.
Right.
So the student facing part of it would be the success criteria that was teased out. And they have that checklist of knowing this is what I need to do specifically to be successful. And
It's
then,
also interesting because as I'm listening to you, Star, one of the things that continues to strike me is that any assessment that's designed, whether it's a formative or a summative, it also is a learning opportunity. And so
yeah,
I think what you're starting to bring to the forefront is how do we continue to communicate our process, whether it's an instructional move or an assessment move, under the umbrella of it being a learning move. Because ultimately, when you're starting to say, that you have clarity on the success criteria, if I'm a student in your class, it means that I know not only on what is it that I'm going to be held to in terms of a quality expectation, but it's as much an evaluative tool as it is a process tool. And
mhm,
so it's really sort of the learning moves that I'm making along the way, which goes back to something that you were saying earlier in this third segment is what could you do now that you couldn't do before, and how do you know? So my growth over time is as valuable to chronicle and reflect on as is the ultimate place where I arrived at the end of the experience.
I would even argue it's more important. If you could identify the steps you took to get to that end, that's what's going to make it something you can replicate.
Mm.
And when we're thinking about, really mastering learning or skills, the thing that takes proficiency to masterful, in my opinion, is the consistency at which you are able to do it without support.
Yeah.
And that's what I used to say to students. Feedback is great and you'll get it as much as you can, but the ultimate goal is to take the training wheels off so that you don't need me to tell it. You have my voice in your head and you know that
Yeah.
this is what you need to do. And by the time you master that, it's time to move on to the next skill that's going to add on to where you are right now.
Yeah, and Star, you're already foreshadowing into our last and final installment where we are going to talk about feedback and transparency. The one aside I'd love for you to make a comment on before we close out this third segment is the importance of teachers reading student reflections and self-evaluations. Again, there are so many times that we, with best intentions, we ask them these really important seminal questions. They do a lovely job in terms of their level of interaction. But there's this moment where if students start to be clear that what they're writing is not necessarily driving the next level of work, it's not necessarily impacting how you're differentiating or the kind of feedback you're given, all of a sudden they become a little less willing to engage in that conversation. So talk a little bit about the importance and sort of the reason why, in terms from a time point of view, why it's so significant.
So I'm going to start with a teacher example. Okay. So when I was in leadership, I had inherited this thing where teachers had to submit their lesson plans, for the whole week in advance on Sunday or Monday. And I quickly learned that with all the other things I was doing as a leader, the likelihood of me actually reviewing all 40 of my teachers' lesson plans for the entire week was ridiculous, right? So I'm asking them to jump through a hoop that I'm not even using to establish whether or not when I walk into their classroom at any given point, what am I using this for? What's the point of it? Is it just to hold them accountable for the fact that they submitted something that they were supposed to do? Or am I using it in some kind of instructive manner that's going to help me when I go into a walkthrough and figure out where they might need support or what I'm going to be looking at and what kind of feedback I can provide them? So the first thing I did when I took that role was get rid of that rule, because I trusted them as professionals. Like, you don't need to share your lesson plans with me as long as you have a plan that works for you and it suits the pacing plan that I do have and you're in the ballpark when I walk in your room. I don't need for you to jump through that hoop just to check a box. And unless I'm going to do something with it, it's extraordinarily unfair of me to ask you to jump through that hoop. So now taking that into the classroom with kids, at first, asking them to reflect and self assess is going to feel like extra work, right? Because not only are they doing the assignment you've asked them to do, but you're also asking them to write or construct something that is about their learning, that's additional to the thing that you're asking them to submit, the product. And they might go along with you to do that a little bit in the beginning if you insist it's important. But if you don't give your time to show that it's important, they will revolt, because essentially it is a whole other assignment you're asking them to do with this already challenging assignment you have likely asked them to do. And you're missing out on a huge opportunity, because you learn so much about kids in their reflections. You learn about their process, first of all. You learn about the things they enjoy doing. You learn about the things they don't enjoy doing and why, like, those are all important things to invite their voice in. And more importantly, if you're a teacher like I was in a city environment where your classes are big, 34 kids at a cap, like, how do you meaningfully differentiate or personalize learning in that space on a regular basis if you're teaching in a traditional paradigm?
Right.
Like, you're teaching to the middle and there's no way, like, there's very little for your high, your folks who need to be pushed, and there's even less usually. And then if you start catering to the lower third, you're losing a lot of kids in the middle who are bored.
Yeah.
So by having this information, you have this rich toolkit and map of how you can be really intentionally changing your learning space
Yeah.
to make it meaningful for all the learners in your space.
Well, and you're also thinking about the drumbeat that we talked about earlier about making it their space too, not just your space. So
Right.
it's something that you're connecting individually, one-on-one, but you're also honoring that the personalities of classes are different and it changes your not just delivery of information, but it changes some of the assignments themselves. Sometimes it changes the pace of learning. But ultimately, when you're starting to play out the idea of the significance of reflection and self-evaluation, it is something that if you don't take the time to show what potentially it looks like, how you've also grown as an individual in terms of the level of reflection. The last thing that I want to point out is there's a fabulous teacher in the book. I don't know, Starr, I'm trying to jog your memory about a teacher that basically said she was terrible at reflection. So she
Kristen
resented reflection.
Pizarro,
Like,
Pizzo for Pizarro,
yeah,
Pizarro, Pizzo. Yes, she's brilliant. She's an absolute brilliant teacher, and I loved her example of like her experience as a reflector, and then how she brought that into her senior classroom as well.
yeah. Because again, I think on some level, there's some folks that are sort of hardwired to be future forward, and they're not necessarily interested in engaging in a post-mortem conversation. They're already like 10 paces ahead and starting to take, especially people that are, for example, in the case of the teacher that you interviewed, was brilliant. Sometimes actually slowing down can potentially start to create a level of anxiety and uncertainty and self-doubt. So I think that the dynamic of how do we do reflections that are very much responsive to the learner, but also responsive to sort of the personality and approach as to how they are making sense of their learning experience.
And to that end too, like you'll have some kids who want to revise a million times when they get the feedback, and then you'll have other kids who will want to apply the feedback the next time they try something new.
That's right.
And I think having a balance between, that application to a new space versus just revising to death, which I think that there is a point where you do kind of have to say, all right, I've given you a lot of feedback on this piece. And part of the reason you're being so successful at it is because we've iterated together so
Yeah.
many times. Now I want to see you apply that the next time around without me having to point it out to you. And then we'll know you really got it. But at this point, and I think this is where teachers sometimes too struggle, because they're like, it's not an authentic level of proficiency or mastery because of the amount of times
Right.
they've iterated on the same thing and they're only doing it for the grade, which is when you say, no, if it's truly about learning, they'll be invested in making sure they apply that learning moving forward as well.
Absolutely. All right. So tune into our last and final installment around feedback as learning and assessments and how do you actually set up your gradebook. All right. So thank you again, Starr. And again, we'll create a link on the bottom if you wanted to go ahead and purchase Hacking Assessment 2nd edition. Thanks.